is a controversial. The topic today is a controversial one that many people on the left would prefer to avoid. Anyone who investigates Russian propaganda on the left risks accusations of being part of a new McCarthyism, having their computer hacked, or in the case of researchers like Alexander Reed Ross and Kate Starbird, threatened with lawsuits. As John will discuss, the Putinized left existed before Russia invaded Ukraine, but the invasion brought increased scrutiny and challenges to its purveyors, whether they are so-called journalists, activists, organizers, or social influencers with direct ties to Russia. As a result, it is harder to get the receipts, as they say, but we will not stop trying. Since Israel's extermination campaign in Palestine began after October 7th, a central focus of our work has been to unite the struggles of Ukraine and Palestine. That work is made much more difficult because the movement for Palestine has been and continues to be influenced by Russian propaganda. We know from many full-time researchers, especially Ukrainian experts, that it has increased around the world in the last year, especially in the global south. It's a danger we cannot afford to ignore, not understand, and not combat. The Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign presents periodic online forums on many topics. All of our forums are recorded and can be viewed at our YouTube channel. If you have just recently learned about our campaign, please see more about our work on our Linktree and follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. If you'd like to become more involved or suggest topics or speakers for future forums, please send me a message in the chat. If you'd like to be added to our email list for future forums, let us know. Our next forum, which we consider to be part of our Unite the Struggle series, will be in May on the environmental costs of war and genocide, Ukraine, Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon. So for the presentation today, John will give an approximately 25-minute presentation, and afterwards we hope everyone will share their views, your knowledge, and your experiences, including how we can rebuild a healthy socialist movement. A disclaimer, John has spent hours working on this presentation, but there is much that he will not have time to cover. This topic requires an entire book, or maybe more than one book. One aspect of this that will not be covered in the presentation is the left media. Hopefully that can be addressed in the discussion. So John is a retired carpenter and union activist and a lifelong socialist. He was the recording secretary for Carpenters Local 713. He was expelled from that union for fighting for the membership, in particular for his leadership of a large wildcat strike in the San Francisco Bay Area in 1999. He is also the co-chair of the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign. Okay. John, are you there?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Cheryl. And I just want to say, first of all, this presentation is to a great extent the product of discussions amongst several comrades in the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign. It takes the form of a slideshow. So with that, we're going to begin. Today, an enormous crisis has opened up in U.S. and in fact in world politics. That vacuum is in part defined by the degeneration of the socialist movement, a movement that continues to decline despite the enormous discontent that exists within the working class and the youth. Part of the reason for this degeneration lies in long-term historical reasons. But I'm going to deal with a more recent phenomenon. How the left, socialist and otherwise, has allowed itself to be influenced by, and even at times supported, the fascist-connected Putin. And as an aside, I should just add, some people have asked me why I don't actually refer to Putin as an actual fascist. And the reason is, and I know there's some disagreements on that in my opinion, the Putin regime is not actually fascist. It's just connected with and influenced by and has elements of fascism within it. Putin has built a base through the Russian Orthodox Church and the ideas of what is called traditionalism. That means a return to the old so-called traditions, especially what we know in the US as family values. Central to that has been demonizing LGBTQ plus people. Putin also linked these ideas with support for a return to the old Tsarist Russian Empire. Now, in the US and elsewhere, the so-called anti-imperialist left tends to support whoever opposes US imperialism, not opposition to capitalism itself, just to US imperialism. And through this tendency, Putin has been able to ensnare much of the left in a far-right web. There are historical precedents for this, going all the way back to the German Nazi Gregor Strasser, who combined anti-capitalist rhetoric with anti-Semitism to draw Germans into the Nazi Party. That tendency was called Strasserism. While there are important differences, there are also some important similarities with what Putin and his agents and assets are doing. So I think today, a similar tendency could be called Putinism, hiding behind, quote, opposition to US imperialism, and at times also mixing hints of anti-Semitism. Putinism has brought large sectors of the left, including the socialist left, into this far-right web. So when Putin started to intervene in Syria in 2014, the so-called anti-imperialist left in effect supported not only that intervention, but also the brutal Assad dictatorship. The so-called anti-imperialist left joined all sorts of far-right groups like the British National Party in supporting Assad. We take a break here for you to study the names and the faces of these so-called left Putinists who traveled to Syria as guests of Assad. So to continue on, it wasn't just trips to Syria, it was also similar trips to Russia. A really revealing moment occurred at the 2014 conference in Moscow of the Anti-Globalization Movement of Russia, the AGMR. That group was founded and led by a man named Alexander Ionov, and the AGMR conference was about building a base for ethno-nationalism. That means nationalism based around a particular ethnic or ethnic religious group. For example, Jews, that's to say Zionism, or Hindus, Hindutva, Muslims, or Christians of European descent. That is what a nation means to them. The AGMR conference uses the right of nations to self-determination to hide their real ethno-nationalist aims. Ethno-nationalist states with everybody except for the chosen group unwelcome. Major figures of the Putinized left attended, alongside actual fascist racist groups like the League of the South from the US. The Putinized left had no problems rubbing elbows with these types. However, the real coming out party for the Putinization of the left occurred with Russia's all-out invasion of Ukraine in 2022. NATO was at fault. Ukraine is full of Nazis, they cried. They were simply channeling Putin's propaganda. In addition to the so-called left supporters and apologists for Russia's invasion, we have a whole college industry of journalists and so-called independent investigators who do the same thing. These types have joined forces with the QAnon-based far-right Republican Party. No less than Mike McCall, the Republican chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and Mike Turner, Republican chair of the House Intelligence Committee, have said that some of their fellow Republican representatives are spouting Putin propaganda. Take, for instance, this shot of far-right Republican, bigoted Senator Tommy Tuberville. An outgoing Republican Congressman Ken Buck called Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is as close to an outright fascist as there is in the US Congress, Moscow Marjorie. Now it is true that the theoretical morass in which socialists have found themselves was fertile soil for this rise of Putinism. But in many cases, these Putinists turned in that direction for the money. Neville Roy Singham is a tech multimillionaire who is connected with the ruling party in China, the Chinese so-called Communist Party. Singham got his start by undermining the rank and file base of South Africa's most militant union, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, NUMSA. Fashbusters, the anarchist group, first documented that over a 3-year period from 2017 to 2019, Singham had donated over $100 million to a few US-based, quote, left groups. Some of that money went to Code Pink, but the largest amounts went to the People's Forum, which seems to have acted as the distribution center for other groups. First and foremost, the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I'll give you a few seconds to study this chart. We should pay special attention to the Party of Socialism and Liberation, PSL, which is running Claudia de la Cruz, formerly co-director of the People's Forum, for president. PSL is playing a prominent role in organizing protests against Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. But few people are aware of how PSL is actually a Putinist agent. Here is de la Cruz laughing it up with her fellow Putinists. In the background are a few of the Syrian babies killed by Assad's poison gas attack. De la Cruz and the others let Assad off the hook for that crime. In other words, PSL collaborates with the far-right supporters of Assad and Putin. Now, at the same time, we have Alexander Ionov of the anti-globalization movement of Russia, who has built ties to those on the supposed left, like the so-called African People's Socialist Party and others. Meanwhile, Ionov has financed an agent named Maria Butina to work with the right-wing and racist National Rifle Association. So to summarize before moving on, we can see how, in a very direct way, the agents and assets of Putin have brought what passes for the left and even socialist groups into alignment with the far right. By entangling themselves so closely with the fascist-connected Putin and his agents and assets, this Putinized left has gone too far to reverse course. They have betrayed the most important principles of socialism. Not all are taking money from these sources. Others are simply going along with them to get in with the in crowd. Opportunism, in other words. But how can one own up to that betrayal when one has actually been taking money from Putin and or his agents? How can one ever admit to that? In the natural world, a species can evolve down a certain road, and when the environment changes, that species must become extinct because it has evolved too far down that road and cannot return. So it is with the evolution of the Putinist, quote, left and their supporters. We must recognize that the Putinist left, those who defend or apologize for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, cannot ever recover. They have betrayed two central principles of socialism. The first is international working class solidarity. The second is recognizing the role of the working class as the subject, not the object of history. And having forgotten about the historic role of the working class, the Putinists go on to ignoring the experience of our class, for example, in Iran, Syria, and Ukraine. How can one ever apologize for that butcher Assad without betraying those principles? How can one ever make the slightest apology for Russia's bloody imperialist invasion of Ukraine without these same betrayals? It is one thing to make a mistake. We all do that. But betrayals like these are a qualitatively different matter. Because of long associations, or simply because it puts us in a minority, it can be painful to recognize this, but recognize that we must. Failing to do so seriously undermines our ability to organize an opposition. It makes it difficult to really play a role as a midwife to the birth of a new socialist movement. Those who insist on trying to retain ties with the Putinized left actually run the risk of acting as a conduit between the Putinists and a new, healthy socialist movement. They can tend to open the door for the Putin apologists to having an influence in the new movement. Reluctance to recognize that the Putin apologists cannot turn back leads to reluctance to accept the necessity of fully exposing them. I say this having seen a series of debates between defenders of Ukraine and the so-called left Putin apologists. I listened to several of these debates and tried to put myself in the position of somebody who just wanted to know more, who didn't really have a defined position. I think I would have come away pretty confused. Here, I have to give some concrete examples in order to be clear. Bill Fletcher Jr. is a prominent defender of Ukraine in the United States. He debated with the Putinist Medea Benjamin. In his debate, he called her a, quote, friend, and he emphasized how much he respected her overall. Presumably, that is because he sees Medea Benjamin as playing a positive role in the future. Now, Medea Benjamin is a supporter of the right-wing Iranian theocracy. Had that been exposed, it would have completely undermined her credibility. But Fletcher couldn't expose that if he considers her to be a friend or wants to work with her in the future. Howie Hawkins, former Green Party's 2020 presidential candidate, debated the Putinist Jill Stein and also at another time Margaret Kimberly. In those debates, Howie refused to expose their real roles. For example, while debating Kimberly, he failed to expose how she had collaborated with the fascists at the 2014 AGMR conference. Today, the anti-globalization movement of Russia, AGMR, features Ahmadinejad of Iran and Assad of Syria as honorable members and features Margaret Kimberly as a strategic partner. Howie also failed to expose how Jill Stein had associated with the fascist-connected Putin and how when she campaigned for president in 2016, she actually supported Trump, whom she called a peace candidate. Since then, Howie has justified this failure in two ways. First, he says he opposes what he calls, quote, ad hominem attacks. But people don't think in rigid categories. When confronted with two different sets of facts, two different versions of history, people tend to just throw up their hands and conclude it's all so complicated, I don't know what to think. Maybe there's an element of truth in both sides. But if they see that one side is totally untrustworthy, that plays a major role in what they conclude. Here is an example from my own activity of why it's vital to expose the person that we're debating. I once debated a union bureaucrat in my former union about our going on a wildcat strike against a rotten contract. This bureaucrat claimed he agreed that the contract was no good, but said the strike would be a tactical mistake. He posed as our ally in order to convince us to do nothing. A whole group of rank and file members were listening, and I could see that they had become unsure about the matter. Then I pointed out that the same bureaucrat had had a chance to stand up against the contract in the first place, and he'd said nothing. That could be called an ad hominem attack, but it put the icing on the cake. The members completely rejected his argument. One could say that the bureaucrat's former silence had nothing to do with the validity of his argument, but that's not how people think. We see things as a whole. It's the same with listening to a Putinist like Medea Benjamin or Margaret Kimberly or Jill Stein. Howie explained in a moment of frankness that he didn't want to burn his bridges with Jill Stein or presumably Margaret Kimberly. But if we recognize that the Putinized left cannot play any positive role in rebuilding a left or socialist movement, one based on at least some sector of the working class, then we will not be concerned with burning our bridges with these Putinists. There is also a related issue. It is vital to look up the struggle for Gaza and Palestine with the struggle for Ukraine, and it is also natural. However, most of those who organize the pro-Palestine events do not support Ukraine, although many of the participants of those events would if it were raised. Doing so, of course, would put a speaker in conflict with the others on the podium. So what? It's important. Another Ukraine supporter, Blanca Misset, had exactly that opportunity. She spoke at this Labor for Palestine rally in Oakland. Unfortunately, she did not take advantage of this golden opportunity to make that connection. That was a major mistake, especially because, in my experience, there were many present at that rally who would have really liked that connection had it been mentioned. There are other examples, but before passing on to some other points about perspectives and program, I should also mention the issue of security. This is a very serious and very real issue for those who have family in Ukraine or Syria or Iran. How can they feel secure for those family members if they are in contact with people who have links to the Putinists? They cannot and should not. We who come from the US must not belittle this issue that can mean life and death for others. Now, where does all of this leave us? The Putinization of the left, including the socialist left, is a result of many decades of degeneration. Hopefully, it is the final stage in that degeneration. In that case, it means the decks are being cleared for a new, healthy, and working class based socialist movement to develop. Meanwhile, a huge vacuum is developed. In such circumstances, on rare occasions, a tiny group that ordinarily would be unable to actually affect events can take on a role way beyond what is usual. But that is not the normal course of events. Much more likely is that it will be developments beyond our influence or control, what are called objective developments, that will force a new movement into existence. Here are a couple of examples of such a possible crisis. There are a number of possibilities stemming from the upcoming US elections. One is that the QAnon-based Republicans could overturn the election results in a couple of states, putting Trump in the White House. Another is that they succeed in getting a victory for RFK Jr., that stalking horse for Trump, in one or two states. If that happens, then it's entirely possible that no candidate receives the majority of the votes of the Electoral College, which would make the US House of Representatives pick the next president. Since that majority of states are Republican controlled, they would automatically pick Trump. In either case, a political explosion could result, one which could get out of control of the NGOs, the union bureaucracy, and similar forces. Another possibility is this. It seems to me that Netanyahu is trying to provoke a wider war with Iran. If he succeeds, Biden will jump in with both feet. A direct war with Iran can have all sorts of global consequences. In my opinion, domestically, it would also probably seal the fate of Biden in the coming election. These are just two of many possibilities in an increasingly volatile world. The overall point is that a new movement of, by, and for at least a sector of the working class is necessary for a wide-scale renewal of the socialist movement. We don't just passively wait for that time. We do what we can to try to build links with the working class and working class youth. We encourage the birth of a new socialist movement. We can do, first and foremost, by trying to unite the struggles against invasion and repression, the struggles conducted by millions of people in Palestine, Ukraine, Syria, Iran, and elsewhere. We have to link that with the struggle against repression in whatever country we live in. In the United States, that means first and foremost the struggle against the Putinist Donald Trump. And in that struggle, we always emphasize the independent role of the working class. There are a few programmatic points we can raise. These include calling for no arms to Israel, send the arms to Ukraine instead, seize the assets of the Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs. These include the assets that have been laundered into real estate investments here in the United States and elsewhere. Build a working class movement to stop Trump and similar figures around the world. Campaigning to unite the struggles goes hand in hand with studying both the recent and more distant history of the working class movement, including its socialist wing. That also includes, by the way, the anarchists. It goes hand in hand with struggling to understand the complex and confusing present situation. There's no way to do that without thoroughly rejecting all of the influences of both Stalinism and Putinism and breaking our ties with the Putinist so-called left, no matter how much that might place us in the minority for the present. We must base ourselves on what has been learned in the past, coupled with the knowledge of the younger generations are contributing. That is actually a fascinating process. It is what keeps our minds and spirit alive, and it is the method that we must use to play a role in contributing to the building of a new and healthy working class-based socialist movement.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, John. Yeah, so discussion is open. I'd like to ask people to limit their comments to 2 to 3 minutes. Hopefully we can have several rounds. After about 40 minutes, I want to bring John back in to make any comments while everybody is still here, but we can continue the discussion after that. So I'm assuming everybody here knows how to use the raise their hand function in Zoom, but if you don't or it doesn't work, just go, do something like that. Linda, go ahead.
Hi, this is Linda Mann. I'm in the USSC myself, and I want to augment one of John's comments that the anarchists on the left-wing anarchists, I mean, in the United States and on the West, have really played a pivotal role in fighting fascism, and that's basically what we're fighting now: is fascism here at home, with Trump, and fascism abroad. I mean, I consider Russia to be objectively fascist. I realize that there's a point of contention over that because it's not quite a mass movement, which is what is usually required. But I mean, semantics aside, we should look to the anarchists because they've done a lot of work on combating fascism, and we need to follow their example better. That's all I need to say.
I think we're as socialists and as a sort of progressive democratic socialist movement, I think we're at an absolute turning point. I think we're sincere socialists, morally consistent socialists, are definitely marginalized, are definitely in a very weak position. But the needs for what we have to offer is huge, absolutely huge. If we're, the morally consistent left that haven't sold out in one way or another, and we communicate very effectively amongst each other. I've noticed that there's political diversity here, that it's perfectly okay and perfectly possible to be a sincere left and politically diverse at the same time. And that offers exciting possibilities. In the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Group, the quality of discussion is good. Now, I'd want to take the value of what we've got and package it and put it out there and turn it into a vehicle so that our high quality discussions become a source of political education and a way to, quite frankly, sell what we've got. So we're getting double value for our work. So, I'm keen on some kind of think tank site that pushes out what we've got. Okay. That's a proposition, I mean, the goal is to obviously maintain the credibility of morally consistent socialism in the face of a wave of really bad left politics. Yeah.
Marussia.
I'll write that up if you want. I can write it up for the group.
Okay. Marussia.
Thanks, John, for your talk. You know, it's important information, but it does focus on the what you call the anti-Putin left, and I think there's possibly an even larger number of leftists who are, you know, against Putin. They see there's a problem there, but they're not in any way going to support Ukraine or Ukraine's struggle for self-determination. And part of that is the, you know, as one Ukraine scholar put it, Ukraine must go with Russia so NATO does not get stronger. I feel like that just sums it up in a nutshell. Part of it is also xenophobia and a kind of common sense understanding of Ukraine as primitive, which is an idea that comes out of Soviet propaganda, or, you know, being, you know, a kind of foolish diaspora engaged in food and dance. And frankly, our diaspora or organized diaspora doesn't help with that. So I don't know that I have a solution. I mean, I try to keep writing and educating. I do feel like the Palestinian movement, I mean, I've been engaged in solidarity with Palestine for, you know, probably a couple of decades. So I do feel that that is the place to start speaking to people. I feel like we have to organize locally and do what you guys are doing in the Bay Area, like go to the protests as a group and, you know, with our flags or placards or whatever, and start conversations there. But I do find myself really stuck in terms of that intransigence with, you know, even I would say my left friends, in that there's just something in their minds slightly pathetic about Ukraine. And, you know, it's a failed state. Now it's, you know, now it's pro-Israeli. I mean, people will seize on whatever comes up, like Zelensky's latest statement, and use that as the reason they're not supporting Ukraine. But I've noticed that those reasons change all the time. So, you know, that's the chink in the armor. Maybe it just, you know, maybe Ukraine just needs to look cooler. I think there's also a kind of, you know, there's a certain sort of fashion around what struggles get supported and which don't. Yeah, I don't have any sort of recommendations except for the need for local organizing and education.
Talmadge.
When this war conflict started, well, I should say not started, but when the invasion happened in 2022, I immediately went to what I thought at that time was a viable source, which was John Mersheimer's work at University of Chicago, which was a global strategic analysis, an abstract analysis of these national tendencies built around the idea that nations have separate spheres of influence, which many of you have known about. That's also precisely what Putin's position is as well, as it was for Henry Kissinger and others. And for that reason, when the invasion happened, I was somewhat like, well, okay, so what? Why should I be caring about this? And then I was informed by one of my graduate students in Chicago who was heavily involved in the Ukrainian community. And she says, what the hell are you doing? You know, you're a liberal professor. Why are you doing this? And so I felt totally embarrassed. And I realized I didn't know anything about Ukraine. I knew nothing about Ukraine. All I knew was this abstract geostrategic analysis that had nothing to do with the bodies dropping on the ground. So I began a book study group on Ukraine. I began to look at Timothy Snyder's lectures on YouTube, from Yale University and educate myself about the history of Ukraine, the history of the Soviet Union, the history of the Russian Republic. And what I came away with was thinking like how not only ignorant I was, but how ignorant everybody around me was, including my comrades. And so I got into a vicious fight with a dear friend I've known for 40 years, who's a historian in Turkey, and who basically said, well, we can agree to disagree, because he bought Code Pink's argument. And this is somebody who's not a right winger. He's not like a centrist. He is on the left, but he's also, you know, he admitted it. I'm ignorant. I don't know what's going on over there. And so I think part of the problem here is the lack of education among the left. It's not just ideological pro-Putin. It's just they just do not know, partly because of American exceptionalism, that somehow if we don't read and understand about other cultures, that's okay because we're the top dog in the fight. And I think that, you know, in many ways, I think this is what I'm going to conclude with, is that a lot of this kind of propagandistic models that Putin operates on about dominating the information space is a result of this American exceptionalism that masquerades as a form of neocolonialism on other parts of the world. And it's a kind of acceptance which I think most segments of the left have not understood, how they are implicit in this process of reproducing the same crap that they say they criticize. So I'll leave it at there.
Okay. Nikolai.
Megan. So I wanted to address specifically the topic of Ukrainian and Palestinian solidarity and how that feeds into this broader topic that we are discussing. So I'm I'm lifelong anti-Zionist Jew, and I have been involved in a lot of pro-Palestinian organizing. And something that I have noticed when I show up in these spaces and when I speak is that I also speak about Ukraine, and I also speak about my perspective from that point of view. And I speak about the connection in terms of like liberatory struggle and Russian imperialism in Ukraine. And I find that when I am individually speaking to people, when I'm in a group of people and they're just there to listen, they're not ideologues. They're there because they have a certain like human empathy and so on. They generally see the connection and immediately feel that connection and a sense of sympathy, and they immediately start to want to learn more. And I see this happen over and over again, especially in recent times. But then on the other side of it, I see people who seemingly are in the lead in these movements, or who are given the mic, who do not see that connection, do not make that connection, and are even actually quite offended when that connection is made, or just want to push it away as much as possible. And I'm not quite sure how to resolve this problem, other than that there seems to be this very clear disconnect. I've also seen a similar thing, by the way, because I've been involved in a lot of queer activism. I'm also transgender. I've seen a similar thing where when I actually talk about the topic, people around me will listen and they will be sympathetic. But then someone who is in a leadership position, who has the mic, who doesn't care and does not want to talk about it. So yeah, I would really like to hear maybe other people's perspectives on this, or if you have other solutions to push back on it.
There is a left media that I think we can say is well established as being a direct conduit for Russian propaganda. I would say The Nation is in that category, but there are others as well. RT News, which absolutely, you know, it tries to considers the left part of its market. But I think that one of the biggest problems is left media outlets that try to have it both ways. They periodically publish something that supports Ukraine. Most of the time they don't. Several examples of that are, hold on a second here. Democracy Now!, Jacobin, Counterpunch, and Pacifica Radio. There are others, but so, and I believe they are playing a really spreading much confusion amongst the left. And I also think that, so we started this campaign in March of 2022 after the Russian invasion, and I knew nothing about Russian propaganda about the role that it was playing on the left. I have learned so much in that time period. And what I've noticed as I've gotten better about seeing, it's evolving. It's evolving to become more sophisticated and more subtle. And a recent example of this was in the April issue of The Nation magazine. There's an article written by Katrina vanden Heuvel herself, who is longtime connections with Russia, and her deceased husband, Stephen Cohen. And it's about the Moscow terrorist attacks. And if you didn't know anything about Russian propaganda, you might read it and go, she supports Ukraine, but hold on a second, I've got my notes. After reading the article a couple times, I really felt that she was simply using the terrorist attacks as yet another way of spreading disinformation and to plant, basic some propagandistic points about Ukraine. And here's what I saw. So she uses the term, the war in Ukraine drags into its third year. Oh, it's just this horrible thing that's going on. Implication, both sides have equal responsibility. The war in Ukraine continues to metastasize. That's another phrase that jumped out to me. She's critical of you. The Ukrainians are getting really tired of this war. They want it to end. Yet another question looms. Could this tragic attack also offer an opportunity for those advocating a negotiated settlement to war?
2.5 minutes, Cheryl.
Oh, okay. In any case, the point I'm trying to make here is that Russian propaganda in the left, through these outlets that try to play it both ways, are creating tremendous confusion in the left. Okay. All right. Jeff.
And my grandmother emigrated from right on the Curzon line, where the Poles and the Ukrainians were having ethnic cleansings against each other. So I can kind of see both sides, and not both sides ism, but they would come to my family's house and say, you're a mixed blood family, kill your wife and children, or we come back tomorrow and we kill all of you. I mean, that allegedly did happen. And I'm not going to say the Poles or the Ukrainians were more or less guilty, because there were bloodthirsty ethnic cleansers on both sides. And it goes all the way back to the Cossacks and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So I've got as much skin in the game, I think, as anyone. And I was particularly offended when the MH117 was shot down, because I was an AIDS activist, and the people on that plane were headed to an international AIDS conference from Amsterdam to Malaysia. And my brother's a pilot. So I took it personally, and I've worked against Putinism on Facebook for over 10 years. But here's what I have to recommend. I think the time has come to follow Richard Finnegan's suggestion of thinking of ourselves as basically creating some sort of a think tank, or for lack of a better term, you could call it a anarchist Soviet council or whatever. But my main point is, I think the time has come to start looking beyond Facebook, because Bill Weinberg showed he got something like 8 strikes, or no, on April 8th, he had like half a dozen strikes from Facebook. I got 2 strikes last week. One just yesterday, when I posted a screenshot of somebody that was denouncing Democracy Now! Or somebody from a fascist perspective. And I was articulating against that fascist perspective. It was Steven Crowder. And Facebook put up a strike notice that I was being accused of promulgating the fascist language, which was calling was calling Code Pink lady a rat. And I was pointing out that our critique, well, especially in her, because Jody Evans' husband's money, but not everyone who is buying the NATO line is somebody who's paid getting financial contributions from Russia. And I think we should make that distinction. not everyone has the dirty money. Not everyone has gone to Iran. So we can show a picture of somebody that went to Iran or gets money, but we can't paint with a broad brush and say that people who are buying somewhat into that line. Is that a half-minute warning?
Yeah, well, yes.
Yeah, so my 25 seconds. The point I want to make here today is I think we need to move beyond Facebook, because we're not free, we're not at liberty. They also block links. They blocked a link to a very kind of middle of the road socialist group I tried to link to last week. So that's 3 times last week. And so we're not free. We cannot trust Mark Zuckerberg to supervise our discussion. So we need to find another venue, whether it be Mastodon or maybe USSC can purchase a blog site and have her own blog. And that is my main point.
Okay, Rachel.
Well, I guess one thing that struck me from a while, just even reading John's piece before, is my concern about siloing and like where do you draw the line of, who is beyond, where is the point of no return, is one thing. And another, actually, I'm more further on responding to Nikolai about a real challenge in, what do you call it? Well, in like the Unite the Struggle about dealing with the connection between Russia, Ukraine, and Israel and Palestine is how much, well, to the extent to which the Kremlin has really successfully created its own narrative about support for Palestinians, even if it's just window dressing, whereas the liberal opposition, which, I mean, I don't know the numbers and I don't want to sound strange, but there are a number of Jewish activists with old-time connections to Israel, that a lot of people who left after the special military operation and didn't have tons of money and tons of citizenship, like bought citizenship to other places, a lot of them have fled to Israel. And so people that are supporting Palestine will look at them and say, like, okay, but the people that are against Putin, whether it's Russian liberals, I guess that's kind of not the whole opposition, but certainly a lot of the people who have the strongest, loudest mouthpieces and so forth, as well as Ukrainians. I could say, even, again, it's not even necessarily a Jewish thing, it's just of a post-Soviet connection of Zelensky. I mean, as you remember, if you always see from a decade ago, Zelensky and Maxim Galkin dancing on stage at a Kremlin New Year's event, and Galkin, and who is Alla Pugachova's much younger husband. She's basically like a mix between Madonna and Barbara Streisand in Russia, and they have fled to Israel. A lot of Zelensky's doesn't really necessarily understand. He doesn't necessarily understand anti-Zionism. But I guess a lot of the challenge is just countering that in a Unite the Struggles effort is kind of countering that, those lines, or just addressing them is.
Hi, thank you. So I wanted to respond to I think somebody said in the text chat about the idea of going on demos with others who have kind of our point of view, I'd say. And I just wanted to really encourage people to do that with a small group of others. I've been doing that in London on the Gaza demos. We've taken the Ukraine flag, like a banner saying, like, from Palestine to Ukraine, like liberation is our aim, or like variations on that sort of theme, and getting like a really, really positive response. And I wanted to suggest that if this campaign is a sort of kind of international sort of organizing hub wants to augment that, then maybe one thing to do would be to think about producing like a bulletin, which is like something that could be like handed out, and just to sort of really encourage people to kind of get out there, make connections, and like just have a way to start conversations with other people on demos and raise these sorts of issues and make it not just about Palestine and Ukraine either, right? I mean, I think there would have been times where it would have been appropriate to talk about Artsakh. Like, you know, it could be appropriate to say something about Sudan. The point is to sort of like promote like a genuine internationalism, right? That you know, takes all these struggles seriously and all these situations seriously. Which is not to say that there aren't sometimes tensions, right? Because obviously, for example, like, you know, Ukraine is intervening in Sudan, not in a particularly massive way, right? But like that, these sorts of tensions need to be worked through. A couple of people, I think Richard and more recent speaker, have talked about the idea of a think tank. I don't know if the think tank is the right idea as such, but I do think you're thinking in the right direction in terms of we need to build institutions, right? The like Tanki Campus Left has institutions like publications which have been running for decades, things like the New Left Review, Socialist Register, which promote and perpetuate ideas which run really deep, which have informed people's sort of ideological formation for their entire lives. And we don't really have anything, despite the fact that although we're a minority, we're not a minority, as much of a minority as you would think from looking at the left media sphere or left institutions. Finally, I wanted to just say, like, I think we need to be careful about talking about like the influence of Russian propaganda, partly because so much of the popular discourse that there has been a degree of silliness about some liberal discourse about Russian influence. So I think we need to be like quite careful and judicious about what we're saying is Russian influence. I think when we can point to facts about particular people, about, you know, like particular trips they've taken, that's good and that's important and we should do it. But also, like, we need to like take ideas seriously as they're expressed by people. Like, not all realists are specifically under the sway of Russian propaganda, right? Like, realism is a sort of centuries-old intellectual tradition, and people really do believe these things. They're not sort of merely saying them as a sort of like dishonest cover to like, you know, get a, you know, to cover for Putin. Well, I mean, in some cases they might be right, but in other cases, at least, they're not. So I think, yeah, I think we should just be careful about like who exactly we're accusing of what and taking their ideas seriously. Yeah, thank you.
Thomas.
I realized that I made a mistake when I read the name. I was under the supposition that this was actually a space by socialists from Ukraine, that I was going to enter a socialist space of Ukrainians who actually got together. And that was exactly because I had the frustration that when I spoke with the few colleagues that I have in Ukraine, they are still in their own narrative very much, which is very pro-Israel. And I couldn't make them understand that Palestinians, in my understanding, fight the same decolonial, intersectional fight against a monolithic, one-party, one-person autocratic madness as any Palestinian and anywhere else. So then I would immediately come to the things like intersectionality, decolonizing, and since I understand most of you are on Turtle Island, I mean, there's plenty of movements on Turtle Island that I'm sure will be more than pleased to get an olive branch out and say, hey, we get what decolonization means for you, and we get that there is something about oppression. And to take up that narrative and say, this is a narrative, I mean, it could lead much further indeed. Maybe one good example are activists from Taiwan, who at some point made a statement where they said, we understand that some people in Ukraine don't know about Taiwan, don't care about Taiwan, and they will never have enough energy to think about Taiwan. We understand that, but we still think that they deserve to be heard, and we still think that they should be taken seriously. So this kind of selfless, going beyond any kind of national narrative of you're from there, I'm from here. I mean, let's not forget, if we talk about intersectionality, people like Harry Hay, who founded the Radical Ferries, was kicked out of the many socialist movements because he was found to be degenerate, because he was a homosexual and he wouldn't shut up about it. There are plenty of liberations that we can go for here, and if that's challenging, so be it. But I mean, hey, we're in the 21st century, so why not make the move and go beyond degenerate movements and say, what's alive today, and what's intersectional today, and what's decolonization today? And if we say that this is a decolonization, and there are Ukrainians who understand that this is about decolonization, they understand at some point that Palestinians are doing the same thing, people in Sudan are doing the same thing, definitely people in Taiwan sort of like are trying to fight against the very same kind of pushover, then maybe there can be a lot more connections beyond our 20th century understanding than 20th century narratives. Like, personally, I find Mearsheimer to be such a intellectual lightweight that I just can't take him seriously anymore because of this hegemonical one for all, one size fits all thinking, which is just absolutely untenable and unsustainable. I'm probably.
Ovian.
I'm an American, but I live in Canada, and I'm South Asian in my ethnicity and my background. I'm from all over the place, and I have nothing but solidarity and love for the people in Ukraine who are fighting against Russia, against Putin, and that's been that case ever since the war started. But in the last couple of weeks, I've also seen a number of articles about South Asian young men who have been unscrupulously brought to Ukraine by labor contractors that are being now sent to the front line, and they're trying to escape from, the war. They're being forced to fight on behalf of Russia right now. So there've been articles about them in The Guardian. So it just goes to show that this is truly a global war that's drawing in lots of different factions around the world. And I just also would add real quick, I have been doing some research and working on a project, which I'm going to actually be completing today, and I'd be happy to share it with people in the group. I'm writing a paper about how basically the intellectual work of a person I'm sure many of you are familiar with, John Mearsheimer, has led to a kind of normalization of power politics that goes beyond simply what leaders of countries believe, but even normalizing it to the level of this is what an individual person should believe if they want to think properly about international relations. And I've been reading through some of his work on Ukraine, but also some of his theoretical work that he's written in the last few years. He has a book called Liberal Delusions that I've been working my way through. And essentially what these folks say is that might makes right, in a crude way of putting it. That's what they say. They say that any other interceding human emotions are irrelevant. And as a person who is not white, but who's always lived in white countries my whole life. Certainly, I believe strongly in liberal democracy and individual freedom that's protected by liberal constitutional structures. And obviously, Russia is a terrible case of very much the opposite of that. And we see this backlash against liberalism, which is not perfect, obviously. It needs to be more to the left, I'd say. But we see this backlash against liberalism that's becoming more and more normalized as like a common way of thinking for the average person around the world. And Mearsheimer, as I'm sure you know, very popular. He's on YouTube all the time at this point. So I'm hoping to do a bit of a salvo against him here. And try to get this paper out there. I'll be presenting it at a conference among other academics here in British Columbia in the political science field pretty soon. And if there's ways that I can distill those arguments, if that's useful, I can send them out to people in this community, and maybe we can develop some good talking points to counter the so-called quote-unquote realism of John Mearsheimer.
So Nina, you've got your hands raised. Go ahead.
I just wanted to make another comment about Mearsheimer, because I've also lately started hearing him. And what is strange there is that he gives Putin the right to invade Ukraine because that's his sphere of influence. But he seems, strangely enough, to not give that right to Israel, which I mean, not that I think he should, but it seems very inconsistent, because in that case, he should be supporting Israel. And if he has enough, brain power to see that that's wrong, or not brain power, but kind of a moral stance on what's going on.
Oh, Teresa.
Awesome, because I'm somewhere in a park in Berlin, and I just wanted to say hi, and I also wanted to say thanks, Thomas, for the shout out. That's really lovely to hear that one is not just like speaking out into a void on Twitter and stuff. So I'm a political philosopher from Prague, but currently living in Berlin. and it's been really difficult because one really is strangely surrounded by a lot of left that is very, very weirdly pro-Russian and Putinist and all kind of stuff. And I think also just really not able to see Russian imperialism as imperialism, and sort of like still believing a lot of stuff about the USSR being some kind of utopia. Not, I think, so sort of like resentful towards people who are critiquing that kind of image, because we're basically taking away the utopia by speaking about our lived experiences. I mean, I myself grew up under a Soviet military invasion with Soviet soldiers behind my grandparents' house, so it was very personal. And I just wanted to say that a number of us this Wednesday are speaking at a panel organized by Rutgers, which should be good for your time zones, on the 10 years of war of aggression against Ukraine. And it's going to be myself and Yulia Yurchenko and Daria Tsimbelik, who are Ukrainian feminist thinkers, and Aizada Aristanbek, who's a really incredible Kazakh emerging sort of feminist scholar. So I hope that on my phone I will manage to post the link into the chat, and please join us. It's hybrid, so come over. And I'm just glad I heard you all today, because it's like really amazing that there are people in North America who I can actually align with almost more than people in Berlin. So it was healing. Thanks. Bye.
But so one of the things I think that we have in our pocket that has not been leveraged enough is that, so one of the main Russian talking points that they have leaned on, and my background, by the way, is Syria solidarity work for like 8 years, is no US intervention, right? Like that's like one of their favorite lines. And I think we have to grab that and flip it and really run with the fact that that Russia is boots on the ground intervening in Africa. And I think that's like one of our core missed opportunities, is not actually revealing what Russia and China are doing in Africa. And, because also solidarity with Uyghurs and folks in that region of various ethnicities, because it's not just Uyghur people. And then also another major, I would say missed, or like, an opportunity I don't see taken enough, is the relationship to us going like full throttle solidarity with our Iranian comrades, right? And so, because that's really, and it makes a lot of sense. I think you guys kind of get the implications, but like in relationship to the pro-Palestine dynamic right now, which of course we all stand with, but there's a way in which pro-Palestine narratives exist at the expense of Iranians and kind of erasing their voices. And so I think, if we're truly internationalists, we have to make sure that we are elevating all boats kind of simultaneously. And of course, like for our purposes, Ukraine is central, right? And then there's this constellation off of that. But to make sure that that Iranians are not forgotten in this, and that Free Syrians, who are also devastated by Russian imperialism and Iranian imperialism. And I think we have to use that language, because that's what the campus use, right? Is they call it, their campus because they oppose US imperialism. Well, let's spearhead this conversation on Iranian imperialism, because Iranian is all about building out that crescent that goes from Iran to Syria, Palestine. Like they literally, their fantasy is to make that their country, right? Or they're like, I don't know if it's sphere of influence, but it's like, I think like literally colonization. If you look at videos of the Iranian folks like being very aggressive, or I'd say Islamic regime, let's be clear, folks in Damascus doing these sort of like population displacement displays, right? So I just wanted to flag a couple of opportunities, because I know so much of what Putin is doing is making this a global South versus white people fight, And we have to push back on that in every single instance where it's available, make it internationalist. I mean, you know, we can lean hard on the outstanding work of Black feminists that refute all of this, right? That this is collective liberation, like white people are not excluded from liberation, right? And really bring this forward. I think that's part of our challenge, but I think those are some like narrative starting points. And I just wanted to seed those ideas with all of you guys today. And yeah, thanks for listening.
All right. Richard.
Yeah, I guess it's a kind of an emotional tone thing of how we handle the emotions of dealing with very flawed lefts. And I find it kind of interesting that as a basic part of my practice, I talk to the hard and far right online, you know, cross swords with them, argue, discuss, joke with them. And I find it interesting that I feel less angry at those people than I do, say, lefts who have jumped on the transphobe bandwagon. And that's a really serious issue in the UK at the moment, because trans care has been really knocked back. Children no longer have access to that anymore because of the populist right. And emotionally, I'm very tempted today to, you know, go to those left transphobes and give them a good working over and then kick them off my friends list. You know, and that's interesting that I feel more angry at the comrades than I do at the far righties. And basically, we're going to have to work with these people. We're going to have to talk to them. We're going to have to be friendly with them. And we're going to have to win them over by example with the campaigning that we do. You know, they're just one part of our political constituency that we interact with all the time. You know, we can't cut these people out, even if they're being prattish on Ukraine or they're being nasty to trans people. Okay.
Talmadge.
Yeah, I'm going to follow Richard, and I think he's right about this. And I think John and I have talked about this in the same way, that I think that Jeff is also right. If we paint with a broad brush, we not only lose possible connections in our desire to be, you know, have pure motivations, but I think also it's really unfeasible given our lack of numbers. I think we have to talk to people that we don't agree with, however distasteful that might be. And I think that what makes it possible to do that is to be clear in our own positions, as John has stated before. I think that's absolutely essential. And by clarity, what I'm talking about here is and I think this is where I really, really like Megan's perspective on this, and she knows this as well, is this idea of true international liberatory movement that takes the kind of traditional notion of socialism and runs with it on a much larger basis, embracing things like, you know, global climate change issues, like issue of fighting for trans people, fighting for gays and lesbians, fighting for women. You know, the whole panoply that Karl Marx would argue is the whole point of why we exist, which is to struggle for a global international movement of justice, of equality. And I say that because I think the important issue here is that the liberal capitalist order, as flawed as it is, has that rhetoric of freedom, of liberation, which is why it's attractive to many people, even Ukrainians, etc. However flawed it might be, it does have that rhetoric. And what I see happening with Putin is the mobilization of the opposite of that in terms of traditional thinking, of going back to the church, a divide and conquer, of splitting people away, versus embracing in an Enlightenment fashion the possibility of world reason on a global basis in which everybody becomes free in this process. And now that, I don't mean that to sound idealistic. I just think in terms of what is the vision that we're striving for here. And I think Megan summed it up pretty damn well, which is we want to see and support people who are struggling against the oppressor, wherever that oppression might end up, whether it's the Chinese against the Uyghurs, or Assad against Syrians, or, you know, Putin against Russians, or, you know, in our own country, in the US, against Trump and the right wing. But it still means we have to engage with the supporters of those folks, as Richard was saying. I think we can't avoid the engagement. The question is, how do we do the engagement, and what's the perspective we offer that goes way beyond what they think that they're really interested in?
Well, go ahead, John.
Yeah.
And I'll give you extra time. Yeah, obviously.
Thank you. So I'd like to respond, first of all, to a couple of particular comments. First of all, on the unpopularity of socialism in Ukraine. You know, I think the point that we have to raise is, okay, look, number one, that was not socialism. And number two, whatever you want to call it, you have to admit that capitalism has not exactly been very kind to Ukraine since it's been restored. So people who on the left, who in some ways are sympathetic to transphobia, it has to be pointed out, look, in the United States, who is leading the campaign against transphobia is Ron DeSantis, the governor in Florida, who's even further to the right than Trump is. And regardless of whether you understand it or not, regardless of whether you think it's something that's, you know, whatever your views are, that is being used as part and parcel of the attack on LGBTQ people in general, and you have to stand against it. So on this issue of being judicious with the use of about Russian influence and so on, you know, that's true. We don't want to make accusations that are inaccurate, but you will be amazed at how many people who, you know, we basically are spouting a pacifist line or something like that. War is terrible and so on. You would be amazed at how many of them they end up just repeating the Putin propaganda, that 2014 was a right-wing coup, that NATO was the cause of the invasion, all this kind of stuff. So the main points I wanted to make is about how and the degree to which we engage in debate with people on the left, or some who are even not so much on the left, who in some way or another, at the very least, display tremendous confusion on the issue of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And more than just confusion, in most cases, in some way or another, at the very, very least, they put forward a position that would amount to complete Russian victory in that invasion. That is, the US should step out, no US arms to Ukraine, and we have to point that out. And what we've seen is very frustrating, and we do have to argue with them, but we can't just get caught up in the echo chamber of just focusing on them. And what we've seen, I tried to point this out in my presentation, but I didn't really have enough time to develop it fully, is that the degeneration of the left and of the socialist movement has gone hand in hand with the development of a crisis, of a kind of collapse in the working class movement as a whole. And the two reinforce each other. And we will not, yes, we have to fight the fight that we believe in and argue for what we believe in and continue to struggle. But we should not have unrealistic expectations that at this time, as long as the big mass of the working class and working class youth are not that a political, an independent movement of at least a major sector of big mass of the working class does not start to develop, we're going to be swimming against the stream.
Yeah.
And we have to, we can't have unrealistic expectations about that. Now, how can things change? And I'd like to give an example from my own experience, just from a completely different type of experience. A few years ago, there was a rebellion within the Carpenters Union up in and around Seattle, and I went up there. Now, in construction there, the great majority of the construction workers are white, and most of those carpenters were Trump supporters. But while they were engaged in the struggle against the coalition of their union leadership and the contractors, while they were engaged in that struggle, you could see it, that all the reactionary ideas that they held tended to be pushed into the background. And a bit of clarity started to emerge. You could just see it. And then when the struggle receded and in fact was defeated, you could see the reactionary ideas start to come back to the fore. So that was the point that I was trying to make in the end, is that whenever, if and when a movement of the working class starts to develop on a significant basis, that will be the basis for a regeneration of the socialist movement. And it doesn't mean that we don't try to struggle now, but we, my point is that we shouldn't get frustrated and, be beating our heads against the wall out of, with that. Also, I want to make one point, 2 points that Megan raised. One is about Russia. And I had a whole section in my presentation about Russia, but excuse me, Africa. But it just would have made it too long. But she's absolutely right about that, because both Putin in one way and Xi in China in another way are making major inroads into Africa. And Putin, there's the Wagner Group, and then also they have concluded a whole series of quote information sharing agreements between major news outlets in Africa and, for instance, RT and so on. On the issue of Iran, and this is my last point, is I think that Iran, the revolution in Iran, is in some ways the key to, or can be the key to, the whole situation in that whole part of the world. Mainly for one reason, and that is that in that whole part of the world, there's one working class and one population that has a very deep and extended experience with Islamic fundamentalism. And that's Iran. That's the people in Iran. So as a movement starts to develop, I think that, they would be largely inoculated from that influence. And it will be that inoculation and an independent movement of workers against all forms of ethno-nationalism, including Islamic ethno-nationalism. I think that's the key to unlocking the situation in Israel-Palestine also. So those are the main points that I would like to make.
Okay, Tom.
Just some more a question to John. Like, when you talk about the degeneration of the socialist movement, I suppose my question is, like, degeneration from when? Like, when was it actually good? Because, like, thinking about, even Ukraine, you can go back to, like, the Holodomor. I mean, what was the position of the Communist Party of the USA on that, for example? Like, and was there ever really a time when the socialist movement, like, say, at least, like, since 1917 and the advent of the Comintern and the influence of the USSR of the international politics of the global left, has there ever really been an internationalist left? And my other point is just because John, like Megan, raised the influence of Russia in Africa, I want to expand on what I said earlier about Ukraine in the context of Sudan. And just to be really aware, like, if people are engaging with the Sudanese solidarity movement, I was on a Sudanese solidarity demonstration here yesterday in London. It's not necessarily something that everyone will bring up, but people who are engaged with that issue will be aware that Ukraine has sent special forces to fight on the side of the SAF, right? And may also have been training them in the use of drone tactics. There's some reporting to the effect that the drone tactics of the SAF have improved, that they reflect modalities employed in Ukraine. I haven't seen any sort of, like, absolutely locked on, this is definitely what is going on reporting, but it's definitely a suggestion that's out there, right? And in the areas that the SAF has taken over recently, which some reporting, including, for example, the Wall Street Journal says may be in part attributable to this training from Ukraine, there have been war crimes, right? So, yeah, someone's asking, is the RSF extremely tight with Kremlin? I mean, the RSF is kind of more, is more aligned with the Kremlin than the USF to an extent. The Kremlin is playing both sides, but the Sudanese revolution, and the global solidarity movement is extremely anti-interventionist, anti-militarist, extremely a plague on both your houses, vis-a-vis RSF and SAF. So, you know, just to say, if the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign is going to be making propaganda about this, we need to be open to a conversation about what is the involvement of Ukraine on the side of the SAF in Sudan, and what do we say about that, right? We can't just look at it solely like Africa is solely just like a kind of propaganda point. It needs to be kind of worked through as an issue. Yeah, at least in Sudan. Thank you.
So should I go ahead then, Cheryl?
Yeah.
So, well, in the first place, just to respond to Tom, of course, you have to be concrete about Africa and not just some general propaganda. That's a given. Tom asked, at what point did the degeneration start? I don't know. It's such a complex question, issue, and it's it's like saying when a river flows into the ocean, at what point is it the ocean? And in fact, a river at times, if there's a mountain in the way, will flow in the opposite direction, away from an ocean. And so you can't really, it's a very complex process. And if you look, every country is different. If you look in the United States at how a workers' movement and a left movement developed, it developed with all kinds of confusions and steps forward and steps backward, going all the way back 120 years and more ago, back in the very beginning of the 20th century, and in fact, the late 19th century. So, and I mean, I think all you can really say is what were the major influences in the degeneration of the socialist movement. And I can speak obviously with most familiarity about the United States. And of course, Stalinism was a huge influence in that, in my opinion. But even before Stalinism arose, there were huge confusions, for instance, in the early Communist Party. And a lot of those confusions were in the process of being cleared up. And then Stalinism intervened and reversed it. Further points were made here, but we're going to go on to some other issues that were raised.
I mean, so I completely agree with Tom, and John also reinforced that, right? Is like our conversation around Africa, and if we're specifically talking about Sudan, I mean, in all of this, of course, it's critical to center the people who are the victims, right? And to follow their leadership and to have discussions and work in solidarity in ways that when there's confusion that reflects a campist or a Putinized propaganda point of view, that's where we can show up, right? And bring in some political principles and clarity. And in particular, I guess I was thinking with the Sudan situation is, obviously what the Sudanese protesters have going on, that's 1,000% correct and should be constantly uplifted, is their opposition to I'm not sure if they 100% use this language, but to capitalism, right? Like they're actually taking the internationalist position that is on a class basis, right? They're saying we oppose these leaders on the basis of being the capitalist class. And so we can dig into the way in which Ukraine is involved, Ukraine and and Russia. And so I think it's an opportunity for us to bring in actually more socialist values rather than shy away from it. So I hope that we can bear that in mind. The other thing I wanted to kind of underscore, which I know is really the point of this talk today, is as much as, there are people who just have genuinely bad takes, it services Putin to deny the existence of propaganda, right? It services the regime to deny that there is an active and aggressive propaganda campaign going on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, and it's not like pro-Trump election propaganda. It is deep within the left. It is all under the guise of pro-Palestine. And it is also really showing up in a very pro-Hamas, pro-axis of resistance way. And so I just want to name that so that we don't drop that either. Because when we minimize propaganda, it services the regimes who are purveying it, and it furthers the genocide of Ukraine, Syria, etc. And there's, you know, again, Russia has boots on ground in 16 countries. Russia is propagandizing the crap out of Africa. If you read into it, they are just funneling, and as I don't know, John or Cheryl pointed out, right? Like they have taken over media. They, certain media, they have created their own media. Most people do not know that Africa Stream is a propaganda outlet. They treat that as like a legitimate indie news source. And I just want to underscore some of Cheryl's comments earlier, is almost anything that's alt media, almost everything is Putin linked, right? And this gets very hard because, to Tom's point, we can't always necessarily point a finger at it. We don't always have receipts, but we have to figure out a way to maintain this conversation and to be able to point at it. Even if we don't have receipts, we can say, here's why this post constitutes propaganda, whether it's intentional, paid or not. And I think we can pretty strongly actually argue that a lot of it is a concerted network. Like, this is not a mystery. There are lots of people, including Maxime, you know, in Ukraine doing this research. But I just want to make sure that doesn't get dropped in all of this, that like we are fighting in information war. There are two spheres of war. There's the on the ground, and there's this really aggressive PSYOPs campaign that is attempting to basically colonize people's intellects as a way to undermine the entire global left. And I don't think we can drop that in the discussion. I think we have to, it has to be centered as much as all the other conversations. So I just want to make sure that that remains like afloat in our discourse.
After some further discussion, this same comrade made some final points.
Because if we are going to have a future together that is not a punitive, you know, like master's tools, destroy the master's house, Audre Lorde, you know what I mean? Like, we have to be able to be in discomfort with each other and in accountability. Like, if we really mean transformative justice, this is actually what we need to do with each other, is we need to sit down with the Palestinian movement and be like, guys, bad news. We got to talk about this, and we got to be accountable, because we are actually not getting Palestine free until this occurs. Like, I don't see how that's actually possible. I don't see a free Palestine that isn't a free Palestine that has actually solidarityed up with other genocide victims. I mean, obviously we could debate this. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see it. Because I think that it is clutch for us to actually have this clarity. And I also wanted to say, like, in terms of, you know, like, we're all doing our work, we're doing therapy, we're like understanding boundaries. I think we do have to bring that into the work that we're doing, in the sense of, we have to hold boundaries with PSL. We have to hold boundaries. And I appreciate the difficulty of a challenge. Our struggle is naming these as boundaries, right? As coming in like, hey, we wanted to have this like rank and file Palestinian youth movement person here. Hey, friend, you just brought in 6 PSL people. We need to talk about the ways in which PSL is pro-Assad, pro-Saddam Hussein. I think it was them, either that or Workers' World Party, but they're like related. We have to talk about that history. They're pro-North Korean dictator. And we have to be like, is Palestine actually going to get free if we are in solidarity with people who are fans of some of the most repressive, regressive, transphobic, homophobic, misogynistic states out there? Is Palestine really going to get free with that? Like, again, it's like, how can we do that? And I appreciate this is the hard part, right? This is why we're here in this and all of this, because just like dumping that on people in grief is not the way to go about it. So it requires a real social sophistication to understand when and how we can have hard conversations. But I at least wanted to name that, because avoiding the hard conversations is at the expense of Syrian families' bodies. It is at the expense of Ukrainian families. It is at the expense of Uyghurs being sterilized and forced to marry Han men, right? So I just want us to understand what the cost of silence is and really take this seriously. That's it. Thank you.